I always just want the best for everyone. If I say something, I really just want to help people, and I just mean it good. Really, if I say something, I really mean it, and I really just try to help people and inspire and motivate and spread good vibes, have a good time.
Sup guys, another unfortunate video about a very young person passing away. It's kind of a mind fuck for me because when Leo passed away, which was really recent, I feel like I just made that video, I heard a rumor that Joe passed away on the same day, which was terrifying. I messaged Joe at the time, this was months ago, and I said, someone's spreading a rumor that you died, hoping to hear back that it's bullshit. He got back to me and said, not me. Obviously my head was spinning already. I'd been up for like 24 hours straight. Somebody started spreading a rumor it was Joe too. I was glad to hear it wasn't. He said, I don't know how it could think me too, like it connected. I'm doing good, by the way, like hope to be healthy. Have met Leo a few times. I don't do drugs or shit, so I hope I can live a bit longer. Seeing that now is chilling to say the least. And like I said, I've got to know him better over the last couple of years and met him in person a couple of weeks ago. Or I guess it was, 3 to 4 weeks ago at this point, but he messaged me this after. Hey bro, it was a pleasure to meet you finally. I wish I would have had more time to talk with you in person. I said the same thing. I was coming in really late off a flight, so I only made it to this event for the tail end of it, but I did get to meet a lot of people that, it's been a long time coming. And Joe, it was his first trip to the US, and I very rarely travel to the US as well because I'm also not a US citizen. So we were both flying in and got to meet each other for the first time, as well as many other people. And it was really cool. He is such a genuine, kind person. And one of the things that, among numerous other things, but one of the things that really, sent that home for me, or whatever the saying would be, he said, also Tristan, etc. was really cool to meet people. So if you guys don't know, Joe was part of Gorilla Mind a couple of years ago. And Tristan is one of our veteran guys on Gorilla Mind. Not an athlete. He is one of the athlete managers and wears a lot of hats in the company. But it was cool to see Joe acknowledge, someone. Like it became very clear to me over the years that a lot of people who have, big followings or whatever, they will oftentimes attach themselves to people when it's in their best interest for some sort of monetary incentive or clout chasing or whatever, but they will often treat people of like non-importance perceivably or like proportionally less influence to them, less kind. But Joe is not one of those individuals. The guy is a like global celebrity essentially, and treats everyone the same, regardless if it is, you're an influencer too with, big reach or whatever, or it is somebody that, he used to work with within a company like years ago kind of thing. Like he treats everyone as equals and respectfully. And that was cool to me because, Tristan's a close friend of mine and also very close with the brand, and just seeing him say that, I thought it was cool. But anyways, it's, very, very kind, genuine individual, and I think this clip pretty much is a good summation of what Joe was all about and his, goals in the fitness industry, and also just, his intentions whenever he would, put out a piece of content or what have you.
I always just want the best for everyone. If I say something, I really just want to help people, and I just mean it good. Really, if I say something, I really mean it, and I really just try to help people and inspire and motivate and spread good vibes, have a good time.
So that's just a snippet of a 1.5 hour conversation I had with him. It's almost 2 years ago now. It's wild to me that this podcast is that old. September 7th, 2021. So we did that podcast a while ago, and crazy to see, where we've, both come since then, and also, time's flying. It's crazy. So, I'm going to miss the guy. He will be missed in this industry. He was inspirational. he really just wanted people to work out, and he enjoyed working out. He didn't try and, start drama. He actually really just didn't like drama. He was somebody who literally was such a wholesome, inspirational, motivational figure in this industry that he really just wanted to, motivate and get people interested in fitness, and it was beyond, the drugs, the whatever. Like, he didn't even really want to talk about that stuff that much because it was, overarchingly, he just wanted to motivate people to, get active and get in the gym. It was like one of the most wholesome content creators on the internet when it comes to fitness content. And the guy just like reek probably isn't a good adjective, but like authenticity and kindness. Like I said, like I couldn't say more good things about the guy. And fucking sucks. And the impact this will have, especially at the age, it draws a very, very there's a dark cloud of sorts over the industry when somebody at this age passes, where people make pretty rash conclusions about what caused it or what's happening. And there's a lot of divide right now with people arguing in the comment sections about what's going on, what caused it, etc. But overall, it's just a fucking terrible situation. The guy was so young, and like I said, it couldn't have happened to a nicer, more genuine person who just had like such wholesome intentions with his content. So anyways, I heard at about, must have been about 48 hours ago now at the time of filming this video, and his girlfriend has posted a few things. She was literally there when it happened, and she said a few insightful things I think are worth touching on. She said his aunt died 4 years ago in her holiday, and she suspects it could be a genetic issue. So she said that his aunt had the exact same, neck pain. Joe was complaining of pain in his neck, and his aunt was dead from an aneurysm in her neck. So this could be congenital, because maybe Joe has the same thing and he is, predisposed to it, and that's what happened. And that is the rumor mill is circulating, that he had an aneurysm, and that was the cause of everything. Now, there is also speculation about numerous other things, and I don't want to speak in definitives without an autopsy report, and I'm sure in due time, if appropriate, somebody close to him like Steve will gather all the pertinent information, and if there historical blood work, autopsy report, etc., and maybe if there is educational material that can be brought forward from that in a respectful manner, we will have a podcast to kind of go over it and see if we can impart some useful preventative medicine, information that will help people screen for their risk profile and whatnot. But I kind of wanted to go over some of the main factors and variables that are being brought up and give my stance on the situation, because a lot of people are asking, and I don't want to just say nothing, but I also can't go respond to every DM either. And I also don't want to speak in speculative fashion, and nor do I want to, let the comments run amok necessarily with, aggressive stances on one thing or the other. So I don't know. Like, I'm just going to give my opinion based on the information available, and also hopefully impart what I feel to be educational harm reduction information. So anabolic use, a lot of people are quick to say that, how are you going to blame something like the jab when there's an individual who is openly enhanced, and obviously, it was him being enhanced that caused it. So one thing to note about Joe is he was relatively conservative with his dosages. He has essentially been on high normal TRT, what a lot of people in the fitness industry call high normal TRT, which I'll discuss in more detail what exactly that is and what that entails, which, is not without risk, and we'll get into that later. He would transiently implement, super physiologic dosage implementation. More recently, especially for the, competitions, he had started competing But again, he is pretty mindful of risk. And as he gets older, objectively, he's not old at all. But for somebody who has seen people passing away in the industry, like he is a very health conscious individual who got rigorous blood testing done very, very often. And he didn't want to end up with an issue. And he also, clearly suspected that he may be at higher risk given certain genetic predispositions that we'll get into shortly. But anyways, anabolic use obviously is a variable a lot of people are talking about. Blood pressure, unknown what his blood pressure was. He didn't really make content about it, but we do know, chronically high blood pressure is a huge risk factor for blood vessel integrity, health, function, etc. So I just want to put out there, blood pressure is a big factor here that may be intertwining into this whole scenario, which we'll get to shortly. Multiple long flights, something often not discussed because a lot of people are quick to say anabolics or the jab, but long flights for 20, 24 plus hours, there is hypercoagulability risk involvement, especially if you're a genetically predisposed individual. Well, mainly if you are. And then there's obviously other risk factors which compound issues, which we'll get to shortly. Hypercoagulability, another risk factor. This is basically your increased tendency to clot. This can be enhanced through androgen exposure, as well as the downstream metabolites of that, which we'll get to. Long flights, like I said, without adequate, preventative measures being taken, because there are ways to mitigate that risk, which we'll get to. What else? The jab itself has some literature that suggests there may be hypercoagulability outcomes. And then genetics, potentially genetically enhanced risk of hypercoagulability. And this is something you could determine through genetic testing, blood work, assessment for mutations, as well as family history. We'll get to more of that later. There's a prominent clip circulating from Bradley Martin's podcast that he did very recently during his trip to the States. Shortly after we met, or shortly before that, he went on Bradley Martin's podcast and talked about how he was essentially like peer pressured into taking the you-know-what, and he got supposedly 4 of them. Now, I think he got those in Dubai and Thailand, and again, we don't actually know. A lot of people are, just lumping it all together. We don't know what the brand / company was, again, there's even dosage variation between different companies. I'm trying to be pretty hyper careful about the verbiage here, but there is a difference between them all. Even the batches of them may even have variability too. So anyways, he got them supposedly in Dubai and Thailand. Why 4? Not sure, but there is literature available to suggest that there is absolutely impact on certain cardiac markers, as well as hypercoagulability in some cases, depending on the one in question. And obviously there's an individual response element, the factors that come into play here too, because some people will respond terribly seemingly, and some people have no issues whatsoever. This is well documented. Now, rippling muscle disease, something I have not seen many people talk about, but this is notable. The first time I actually came across Joe and his content was, as many of you probably came across him, through the crazy striation, rippling muscle stuff that he did. He would sit there and contract his chest, and then he would hyperextend it, and then it would have a piano chord kind of effect because he was so lean. And he had this, what I presume to be a CAV3 gene mutation that results in this rippling muscle disease, which is otherwise essentially assumed to be benign and harmless, but may not be the case. What I have found, at least, is, and this is back then, I had seen, electrolyte imbalance causing calcium, imbalances and whatnot. And there's a reason this rippling happens, and it's related to seemingly an imbalance in electrolytes, but also there is implications to that may be overlooked. And more recent literature has tied it to Cardiomyopathy, if you don't know what that is, it's a disease of the heart muscle that makes it harder for the heart to pump blood to the rest of the body. So this is a study that I thought was worth mentioning at least. This is rippling muscle disease and cardiomyopathy associated with a mutation in the CAV3 gene. Caveolin-3, the myocyte-specific isoform of caveolins, is preferentially expressed in skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscles. Mutations in the gene basically causes what you know Joe to have. Same mutation can lead to different phenotypes, but cardiac and muscle involvement rarely coexist, suggesting that molecular network acting with caveolin-3 in skeletal muscle and heart may differ. Here we describe an Italian family, a father and his 2 sons, with clinical and neurophysiological features of rippling muscle disease and heart involvement characterized by atrioventricular conduction defects and dilated cardiomyopathy. Muscle biopsies showed loss of CAV3 immunosignal. Molecular studies identified the PA46V mutation in CAV3 previously reported in a German family, I thought that was interesting, with autosomal dominant rippling muscle disease and sudden death in few individuals. So that is, a big standout anecdote that I, really owned in on. Sudden death in few individuals. Scary shit. We suggest that cardiac dysfunction myopathic patients with CAV3 mutations may be underestimated and recommend a more thorough evaluation for the presence of cardiomyopathy and potentially lethal arrhythmias. So I think a lot of people are quick to jump on the jab or AAS train when this is something that is very unique to Joe and I imagine could be a, significant variable. Because again, this is not normal. There are tons of bodybuilders who are literally, 50 pounds more of muscle than Joe in terms of need to oxygenate that tissue and support it. And just being super fucking heavy is not that healthy. They use way more gear to support that tissue. They eat way more food. They do less cardio than him. They are walking around with high blood pressure chronically. There's a lot of people with a lot more significant variables seemingly from a risk standpoint from the traditional vectors that are not necessarily healthy, but these individuals are it's very rare even to see a guy who is abusing the shit out of stuff to drop at 30. I'm not suggesting that it's, good. You're obviously redlining yourself and you will expedite things and end up dying quicker if you are somebody like that who's redlining everything. But still, it is not typical to see somebody who is otherwise healthy and doesn't have some significant variable or unique risk factor dropping just from gear and pushing the bodybuilding. And especially not for somebody who's doing cardio, is mindful of their health and is getting regular blood work, etc. So that is where you get into some of these more unique variables what he said on Bradley Martin's podcast, hypercoagulability from long flights, rippling muscle disease, genetic predisposition. His aunt apparently died 4 years ago from an aneurysm in her neck. So it seems like a very, very, coincidental outcome that, presumably a stroke stemming from an aneurysm in her neck, whether that is a, ischemic stroke or there was a rupture and it was a hemorrhagic stroke. We don't know any details about exactly what happened, but apparently, she had the exact same thing according to Joe's girlfriend. But again, Joe's girlfriend isn't necessarily the end-all be-all in saying what happened, so obviously we should wait for the autopsy report. But interesting nonetheless, and notable that his aunt supposedly had this, and you can't help but wonder, is there some sort of genetic predisposition to weaker than normal blood vessel walls that then gets exacerbated and expedites things through some of these other variables that I've mentioned already. I've seen a lot of people mention that he has a lot of coffee too, and they think, okay, the caffeine must be, the dosages are insane and obviously, led to some sort of, additional factor here. But I've talked to him about that, and the 4 liters of coffee is decaf. He mentioned in the podcast that I mentioned specifically.
Fasting?
In your video, you had a giant fucking thing of coffee. That was
every day, bro.
Yeah.
Wait. Here is my coffee.
Holy shit.
The cup.
So how much of
actually
that?
A measurement cup.
Is that all decaf, or do you have a little bit of caffeinated in there?
Decaf. Yeah, decaf. Sometimes I drink normal coffee, but mostly I'm drinking the decaf.
So I don't think coffee was a big factor in that personally, but I did want to touch on that because a lot of people are saying, oh, he had 4 liters of caffeinated coffee per day. And it's He definitely didn't. So I'm sure he had a lot of caffeine and perhaps the yohimbine and stuff. Maybe there was some element of that on top of it that, you know, contributes to, I don't know, some level of like AFib or something. Like, I don't really know, but I guess it's notable. I wanted to mention at least that the 4 liters of coffee was decaf. So if it was any one specific factor, you know, from this list of variables that people want to own in on, like, I feel like we'd see a lot more bodybuilders dropping like flies right now. And yes, there is, you know, uptick in reported deaths happening, which is notable and should be explored further. But with Joe specifically, to attribute it to one specific thing, like, the guy did things responsibly. It's not like he was an abusive performance enhancing drug, like, you know, addict or something. This is something that the, I don't know, narrative that some of the more mainstream people commenting on, when I say mainstream, I mean like Gen Pop, people who don't understand this, you know, who Joe was and, you know, what kind of a person he was and what he was all about, are jump to assume. There's a lot of people doing that, and I feel like it's a bit, you know, misguided, to say the least, because if it was the case that it was just anabolics, then every single person who is like barely pushing above TRT would be dead right now, who's also had the jab, which, you know, is not the case. Now, again, how many of those people are enhanced, you know, had however many jabs, also had, like, there's just a lot of different things in this equation here that it's not simple. That's just what I want to put it down to. Like, he's a very fit guy, trained regularly, actually did cardio, which is like most people in this industry just like really neglect it, in my opinion, where it's like they do it for fat loss when they need to, but they really neglect the actual heart health component of fitness, and exacerbate it through, you know, heavy body weights, androgen abuse, chronically high blood pressure, not getting their blood work done. He was never holding excess body weights. He wasn't, you know, insulin resistant or anything of this nature. Obviously, he has used anabolics and was open about use, and we'll get into even, is there a risk with even base TRT, because there was a very notable big study recently that I think will provide some clarity on this issue. So let's talk about the gear. So will AAS, anabolics, exacerbate risk? I think unquestionably they will enhance risk. However, Joe was somebody who for many years was essentially on like borderline super physiologic replacement. And when I say that, I add the caveat that a lot of guys who were on TRT, you know, especially in the bodybuilding space, there are individuals who blasted when they were younger, wanted to come off, or simply didn't want to deal with the transition phase of coming off to then try and restore function after many years of having HPTA shutdown, etc. And when they, you know, maintain function through synthetic androgen use, through replacement of TRT, they keep their levels manually maintained at like the high end of normal to maintain like high level vitality, performance, function, have like a semblance of the in-between between not being high risk, but not doing nothing, essentially. So they're kind of like on the precipice of what your body could actually output naturally, or replicating it, frankly, because a lot of people are even, I would say, teetering on the brink of super physiologic, or actually so when they are even in the reference range. And by that, I mean, you can have a total output of, you know, 1,000 that is natural, but the free testosterone ratio and free DHT ratio exhibited by somebody on synthetic replacement using a bolus administration twice a week, or even more frequently, often won't be paralleled with what would be natural function. And I say that where if you are natural, you know, if you have some sort of, you know, malnourishment through diet, or you have bad sleeps, multiple consecutive days in a row, you know, a bunch of different factors, you could have low test, or it is ultimately subject to diurnal rhythm, pulsatile secretion. So it's like going up and down, ebbs and flows. It doesn't just go to, when you get your blood tested and it says 700, it's not going to be 700 like literally all day for 24 hours. Whereas if you're using an exogenous, you know, like esterified testosterone formulation, you are essentially manually maintaining whatever the test level is on paper. You're not subject to these ebbs and flows and natural suppression and this this and that, regardless of what you do. And above and beyond that, your SHBG levels are typically going to be lower, which is going to result in disproportionately high free testosterone. It's not uncommon to see guys who are at the high end of the reference range, even with like really normal mid-level test levels. But in addition, a lot of people don't realize the lower the SHBG, even if your free test is like borderline super physiologic, the SHBG is disproportionately has a disproportionate affinity to bind to DHT and then testosterone and then estrogen. So if you have low SHBG because of, like, depending on your dose of androgen, bolus administration fashion, how you are using it, how much you're using, etc., the more unnatural you get in terms of, I don't know, the amount of influx your body deals with at a time of synthetic drug administration, typically the lower your SHBG and ability to actually regulate androgenicity in the body becomes. So your ability to regulate DHT circulation and activity in tissues is hindered dramatically the more your SHBG goes down. And this goes often overlooked because a lot of people just look at free tests, but they don't realize that SHBG is like so important for maintaining DHT balance too, which is way more androgenic and has significant implications in cardiac remodeling, potentially hypercoagulability, etc. Like the more androgenic you are from a free androgenicity perspective, through this like disproportionately low SHBG, the less natural your like TRT actually is. So that's not to say that that's bad necessarily, or that you shouldn't do that or whatever. It's just like something to be mindful of, that even if you're on TRT, it might not necessarily be representative of your androgen burden as a true like natural. So with Joe though, like we don't really know what he was using, how much, but like at least over the years that I've known him, he was pretty conservative about stuff, and as far as I know, only pushed things relatively I don't know, to like blast territories when he was trying to compete, and that was like months ago at this point, and perhaps he was gearing up to compete again. But at the end of the day, the guy was openly accepted the risks of what he was doing, but he was by all standards like conservative compared to most competitors, for sure. As far as TRT and risk, I know a lot of people are going to be thinking, well, Joe always said he was on TRT and then this happens, how risky is TRT? I feel like this is a good study that I was going to go over anyways, but might as well jump to it in this video because it is going to get more attention probably, and I think it deserves its attention. This news article got a lot of traction. No increased heart risks with testosterone replacement therapy study finds. Men treated for low T aren't more likely than others to have a heart attack or stroke. Still, experts urge caution. Now, this was the first like really significant, in terms of number of enrolled men in the study, randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial that actually assessed the risks of, from a cardiac standpoint, of testosterone replacement therapy. This was, as far as the details of it, was called the Traverse trial, testosterone replacement therapy for assessment of long-term vascular events and efficacy response in hypogonadal men. Traverse had 5,198 men who had all been diagnosed with low T through 2 different blood tests showing a total T under 300 nanograms per deciliter, and also had symptoms of low T. They also had at least 3 risk factors for cardiovascular disease, including high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, abnormal levels of fat in the blood, or a history of smoking. So notable, these are unhealthy individuals overall and hypogonadal. Participants were ages 45 to 80, but most were in their 60s. Half applied a standard dose of testosterone gel to the arms once a day, dose adjusted to maintain testosterone levels between 350 to 750 nanograms per deciliter, while the other half applied a placebo gel. So there was 2 years of treatment assessed here, and on average, there were no differences in rate of heart attacks, strokes, or death from any cardiovascular problems between the groups, which is reassuring for individuals on hormone replacement, because there has not been something like this that to really, tell people one way or the other recently. And there's obviously a huge uptick in the people using hormones nowadays. Now, the study is reassuring for cardiovascular disease risk in the context of test replacement at physiologic dosages. However, 24 men in the TRT group had a pulmonary embolism, whereas only 12 did in the placebo group. So this is like a DVT in your leg breaking off and going to your lungs. 16 men developed a DVT in the TRT group and 13 did in the placebo group. So it would have been great to see if the groups that experienced pulmonary embolism or deep vein thrombosis had hypercoagulability predispositions, but the trial didn't get that granular. But notable nonetheless that despite the actual events not being higher, there was a kind of like enhancement of hypercoagulability in those with higher androgen levels. And I would say in general, individuals that push it to like, you know, from physiologic to like borderline superphysiologic or synthetically induced superphysiologic through what I mentioned earlier with the free DHT, you know, the SHBG manipulations, the chronically like borderline red line kind of hormone status where it would really be impossible to maintain that free test level naturally and free DHT level naturally. Like those individuals probably have a higher likelihood to clot, which I think kind of, again, when I go back to some of these variables we talked about at the beginning, you can imagine like hypercoagulability risks enhanced in certain individuals who also are on super long flights, who do this, who do, like there is multiple variables here that stack. You know, there's nothing wrong with, again, with this necessarily, it's just something to be noted. And this does not mean make yourself castrated and be hypogonadal because, you know, or a borderline castrate and be hypogonadal simply because you think that, oh, there was, you know, 12 more PEs in the study with over 5,000 men or whatever it was. Like that's not a reason to subject yourself to a lower quality of life with, you know, an enhanced, you know, metabolic dysfunction risk and all of these things that would come along with being hypogonadal. Like I would say in general, when it comes to therapeutic replacement for hypogonadal men, the positives typically outweigh the negatives. But obviously that's a conversation to have with your medical provider, not me. But anyways, I just want to give full context here is that there is the cascade of androgen enhancement of erythropoiesis and all these downstream things. And especially when you have like a manual maintenance of like borderline superphysiologic values in a fitness industry where individuals are like on TRT, but they're kind of like teetering on the brink of, it's kind of like high normal TRT, whatever you want to call it. Like there is likely some enhancement of hypercoagulability present. And that's not to say that the outcomes are actually going to increase in terms of like sudden death or things of this nature that weren't reflected in a 5,000 plus person trial, but you know, it's notable when there's other unique variables on top too. Like one thing that I often talk about and might be crazy to people who don't know it, my best friend died at 21 years old from a DVT that broke off in his calf and went and caused a pulmonary embolism. This was almost a decade ago now. He was not somebody who was like, I saw a bunch of people saying, oh, that's what happens when you get jabbed. It was like, this was almost 10 years ago, and this happened just from seemingly, and this is my best guess now, I knew he wasn't open about what he was doing, but I knew he did a cycle of D-ball the year prior, and as far as I knew, he was natural at the time when this happened, but presumably there might have been some gear in the equation, but he was also genetically seemed to have a very high blood pressure, and presumably had some like significant hypercoagulability predispositions as well, which would, again, in certain individuals, like a workup that would determine how you stand would be worthwhile from like a gene mutations perspective, clot formation potential perspective for hypercoagulability. Like these are things to probably vet out before you go down the enhanced road. We often talk about, you know, screening tactics for assessing if you're somebody who could even tolerate the drug burden associated with bodybuilding. Like these are the things to be looking into when you get your baseline panel done too, like your CBC. Like this is something to not just overlook. Like these are basic things that cost, I think at Merrick, we charge like $8.50 for a CBC with differential and platelet. It's like really, really low barrier to entry shit to assess. And you can also check some of the more outlier variables like hypercoagulability risks and whatnot through a more elaborate panel. But this is stuff that should be looked at, and this is, outside of the scope of Joe's situation. I apologize for the tangent, but it is worth mentioning nonetheless. So I've had my best friend died at 21 from a DVT. He was told he just had an injury in the gym. His calf was just like really hurting. He stayed home from the gym, but also took a couple days off work because it got really bad. And then he had a pulmonary embolism after it broke off and went up to his lungs, and he died in his home, just sitting on the couch. So, blood clots typically form from the deep veins of your legs, which is notable because, again, like this with Joe's situation, they were talking about his neck. And again, we don't actually know that it was his neck. It's just his girlfriend saying there was a bulge in his neck. He was complaining about neck pain. And I'm sure there was, something related to that. But, at the end of the day, we're still speculating. But worth noting that he was coming off of a 20 to 24 hour flight from the States to Dubai, if I recall correctly. Either way, he was coming off a really long flight. And this is not uncommon it is rare for somebody to have a DVT from a flight to begin with. But if you're somebody who's in a hypercoagulable state, you are immobile in the flight. We'll get into some of the risks in a sec, but basically it would go into your legs, and from there, it would typically pump into the lungs. But if you have something called a PFO, which is like a small hole between the heart's upper two chambers and is like a genetic defect of sorts, this is something that's genetically determined, the clot can pass through the hole in the heart and travel to the brain, which can lead to a stroke. Now, is that what happened? I don't know, but we'll get into the other stuff. So, risk factors on flights and what to know. Air pressure changes on a flight. So, air pressure changes on a flight can lower the oxygenation of your blood, which may trigger a coagulation cascade. So, there is not a lot of literature on this, but this is a notable study. Association between acute hypobaric hypoxia and activation of coagulation in human beings. So in this study, they had 20 healthy male volunteers in a hypobaric environment similar to that in an airplane cabin, and they were told to do normal stuff, but to avoid, when I say normal, just like how you would behave on a flight, but avoid doing physical exercise. And their blood was tested on entry to the environment created in a modern apartment in Norway. And again, after 8 hours, and what they found was concentrations of compounds associated with coagulation increased to between 2.5 times and 8 times original levels after just being in the airplane, essentially. So the authors point out that a clot during air flights is rare, but serious and potentially fatal. They recommend that passengers with a history of the condition, specific coagulation defects, or other medical risk factors should consider prophylactic use of low molecular weight heparin or other anticoagulant. Second risk factor, other than the pressure, is immobility for long periods of time. So in general, I think the time where they start recommending like certain variables like anticoagulants and whatnot is, and this is again for people who are at high risk, not necessarily everyone. Like you don't necessarily need compression stockings or to be on like low molecular weight heparin or anything if you are otherwise healthy individual with no risk factors. But immobility, this is something that should be noted, is flying. You are in a cramped, confined space for long periods of time, and you do need mobility to circulate your blood from your feet back up to your heart. And if you are in one spot for 24 hours and aren't like regularly doing like calf exercises, movements, etc., to actually stimulate that blood flow, you could end up with a DVT if you're somebody who's predisposed. And there are individuals who have had death days after flights because of this. And with Joe, is that what happened? You know, hard to say, but it seems pretty hard to ignore that the guy was coming off of like a nearly 1 day long flight and had like a sudden acute event like that. Another thing, dehydration. Oh, a tip that's notable is don't shove everything under the seat in front of you. If you don't have to travel with a lot, don't put everything in the overhead bin. Otherwise, you won't have room to move. Doing exercises and staying hydrated are really the best tools we have on long flights. This is what a doctor mentioned who was discussing, this is like reflective of the last study I mentioned, but in terms of how you would go about stimulating this blood flow. and actually ensuring that you are moving things around. Because you, like I said, you're in a confined space. It's hard to find ways to do this if you are confining yourself to an even more narrow space with no room to actually move your legs or do anything. Dehydration. It's easy to forget to drink water when you're rushing to make your flight or not having stuff on the plane with you. Sometimes people are drinking alcohol on flights and not, drinking water, staying hydrated, and they'll take sleeping medications and then pass out on the flight purposefully, and they will not do these exercises. And there's a lot of things that can play into it, but dehydration is not going to help and is going to enhance this hypercoagulable state that can be problematic. Blood pressure, obviously a big risk factor too if you're somebody who's predisposed. And above and beyond that, this is kind of where you would get to if you are somebody with a genetic predisposition to factor V latent gene mutation or something else, or you're just a high risk individual who's on a fuck ton of androgens or whatever. This is where overflight, 4-hour flights, compression socks, absolutely worthwhile. A preventative dose of a low molecular weight heparin, like a Lovenox, is pretty standard that a lot of medical providers would recommend. Or another oral alternative that I become aware of recently is a blood thinner called Xarelto. Oral nattokinase is also promising peri-flight as well. Compression socks reduce the risk of DVT, and I would definitely recommend as well. And all the exercises. So that is something that is absolutely worth considering for long flights and avoiding a DVT in your legs, because this is ultimately what can lead to very avoidable and significant and life-threatening clots in certain individuals, which is fucking terrifying and sucks that more education is not put out about this stuff. Now, circling back to some of the other risk factors, that could enhance this, chance of clotting, or, just whatever may have happened. The 4 jabs mentioned on Bradley Martin's podcast, obviously very significant variable. And I don't know how long ago that was. I don't know which ones he got. I don't know what his reaction to them was when he got them, or what, if he was, side effect free, or what, if there's existing heart damage or scarring. And that is, part of the, variables in this equation, and it's, or what, but there is literature around it that, you could dive into further if you wish. But as far as I know, he was resting. He wasn't subjecting himself to any intense exercise when he had this whatever event occur. And he felt good enough, apparently, to go to the gym. He was waiting for Noel and his friend to either pick him up or go to the gym. I forget what it was, but he was literally lying down with his girlfriend, had neck pain for a few days, had this thing happen, but he otherwise felt good enough to go to the gym, which is interesting, notable. When my friend had a DVT, he was literally just at home, felt like shit, couldn't go to work, intense pain, but it was in his calf. So, the pain in his neck, is that reflective of, again, blood vessel integrity and some genetic predisposition to weakened, blood vessel walls, and also some sort of pre-existing aneurysm that otherwise could have been exacerbated through other variables, the blood pressure, etc. And having a hypercoagulable state leading to a clot forming in the aneurysm, in the neck, and then causing a hemorrhagic stroke, or having an ischemic stroke where you have a blockage of blood flow through a clot formed via the flight that happened. There's a lot of things at play here. Ultimately, what you need to know about an aneurysm, because I think there was a lot of misinformation coming out about what it is. It is an abnormal swelling or bulge in the wall of a blood vessel, and this can be genetic. It can be brought on through excessive chronically high blood pressure, atherosclerosis. There's multiple different things that can cause it, but in general, it's going to be atherogenic burden through plaque buildup, which is probably not the case for Joe, being only 30 years old. although you are like stacking up plaque since, you know, teenagehood essentially or younger, the manifestation of enough of it to actually impede blood flow like dramatically by 30 years old, I would say is low, but who knows? High blood pressure, I don't really know what his blood pressure was, if it was bad or not. And then there is, you know, genetic risk factors as well. And the fact that his aunt had the thing in her neck kind of, you know, begs the question, did he have the exact same thing? And then he sort of just redlined it a bit through some of the, you know, other factors mentioned or what, but it certainly seems to be a unique multifactorial issue here, not necessarily something that can be narrowed down to one variable and then owned in on as something to blame. But ultimately, this is all speculative as to if he had the exact same thing as his aunt, and presumably his aunt had one of these two scenarios where she had either full blockage or some sort of rupture scenario from the pre-existing aneurysm that was, I can only imagine, partially genetic, because this is 4 years ago. She's going to be somebody who's not on androgens, not have been jabbed. Like, a bunch of these factors are not present for the aunt, presumably multiple years ago. So that kind of begs the question, like, what of these other risk factors did she have that led to it? And then with Joe, was it just redlined through some of the other stuff? I believe there is a pretty significant genetic component here. And ultimately, I do think there could have been a pro-thrombotic kind of effect going on with him with some of the stuff and leading to a clot being formed that would have led to an acute event, or potentially some sort of, acute cardiac event as well that was contributed to by, I can only imagine the rippling muscle disease is not a totally benign thing to ignore, especially with some of this literature I found on cardiomyopathy associations. And then the long flight with potential hypercoagulability genetic predispositions that significantly exacerbate your risk for clotting that could then, fill in a existing aneurysm caused by the genetic, weak blood vessel integrity, like all of these things. All compounding. So, what happened exactly to be determined, but I would imagine like the speed at which it happened, it was so quick. And he seemed fine even the day before. He was posting stories in, coincidentally, a hyperbaric chamber. So he went on this long flight, which had the risk of what I mentioned before, the low oxygen. And then he ends up in this situation where he's, I don't know if he did it intentionally to kind of try and like offset it, or if he was just doing it purely for longevity purposes and he heard it was good, or what, or he heard it's a good way to like recover from, a long flight or something. But he was, at least his demeanor in that hyperbaric chamber was very, very positive, upbeat. Didn't seem to have like labored breathing or anything. Like, there didn't seem to be anything notably, perceivably wrong. Maybe he's a good actor, he's putting on a face for the camera or whatever, but if you really like felt like shit, it's unlikely you would be out doing stuff, posting stories, etc. if you were actually somebody who is, I don't know, about to have like a major life-threatening stroke. It seems, I don't know, it's just like a crazy scenario, and that's what it makes me wonder, like the acute outcome. And it wasn't like he subjected himself to extreme exercise either. With some of these like athletes dropping, you're seeing them dropping in seemingly extreme or at least like pretty significant exercise related outcomes, or like triggering some of these like cardiac arrest episodes and whatnot. So with Joe, who's just lying there, and you can only speculate, but I can imagine at least some of the things I mentioned were involved, but to be determined. And we were just speculating, and I'm just trying to put out there some of the variables of risk to consider to maybe relate to your own situation, because as you can see, a lot more thought goes into it than maybe we've otherwise been taught. Like, personally, like if I'm getting on a long flight, like I am absolutely putting on compression socks. I'm looking at the low molecular weight heparin or some other blood thinning strategy potentially. I know there's no evidence for baby aspirin necessarily supporting like better outcomes, but I'm probably looking at that for platelets. As far as screening, what can you do? Assessing your hormone status and basic blood work on like a full panel, but also your clotting and heart damage related markers if you're somebody who is otherwise want to assess like existing damage and or clot formation parameters, you could, I would definitely recommend a CBC with differential and platelet is obvious. CMP, comprehensive metabolic panel, and then you would have things like high sensitivity CRP are definitely impacted by some of these related things. I'm trying to like get as granular as I can without being, but D-dimer as well, troponin, fibrinogen, CK, creatine kinase. Getting a hypercoagulability workup is probably worthwhile as well. This would involve things like checking for a factor V Leiden mutation, and tests. CT angiogram would be what you'd want to use to assess for atherosclerosis and clots, and MRI. Cardiac MRI for assessing existing aneurysms, heart damage, morphology and function, or if you want to go like full blown, you can get a full body MRI and you could assess for existing aneurysms like anywhere essentially and see where you stand in terms of what is going on with the function of all organ systems. If you really want to get, it's expensive, but it's probably worthwhile. And that would cover the majority of stuff realistically. But you could get more granular than that, but I think that is pretty damn comprehensive. I'm not saying everyone should go do this stuff, but it's like, if you're somebody who's high risk and you've otherwise subjected yourself to multiple of these things, or you suspect via like family history and then some of these other variables that I mentioned, you're somebody in a similar boat to Joe in terms of multiple variables stacking up, it may be worthwhile to get some of the stuff checked. And to be more mindful when you're putting yourself in environments that could otherwise be problematic. So anyways, hopefully that was informative. Apologies for the length. Hopefully you guys learned something. Rest in peace, Joe. Fucking terrible scenario. And if there's more information and it's warranted, I'll connect with Steve and maybe we can do a podcast and discuss in further detail, but that is my insight. And, the acute outcomes, stuff happening like in a blink of an eye. It takes a long time for something like atherosclerosis to build up, or some of these like more lifelong risk exposure scenarios to really manifest themselves with, a significant problematic outcome. But like some of the low-hanging fruit, like blood pressure, like just like buy a cuff, have that in your house, check it regularly, get an average, make sure you're on point. That's the kind of stuff that ultimately will be the biggest risk factors, is going to be stuff like your blood pressure. Like, are you always 120/80 or less? If not, you are damaging yourself ultimately. Now, I'm not talking about transiently during exercise, it elevating or whatever, but like if you're just fucking sitting there for 15 minutes and you can't get a rating of 120/80 or less, like you've got to check into your electrolyte intake, diet, body composition, exercise regimen, potentially pharmacology. Like, this is not something to overlook. And I think a lot of people are overlooking blood pressure. And oftentimes I see even people who get like relatively thorough blood work done, they don't even have a cuff at home. Like, that should be one of the first things you do. Buy a blood pressure cuff and get your bloods done. And that's kind of like the lowest hanging fruit. And then some of this more granular stuff you can get into. But that like step one, get that done, is something I could highly recommend. And a lot of the other stuff is worth educating yourself about further though too, but this is like some of the low-hanging fruit. Anyways, rest in peace, Joe, and I will talk to you guys soon.